Morning all. We might make a start then to keep things on track. So welcome to another Earth Institute Coffee Morning, and thanks very much to Orla Kelly for agreeing to speak with us today. So just chatting with Orla, who arrived back in Ireland and joined UCD in the middle of last year. So Zoom has been her only real interaction with the university.
I'm not sure if any of you actually exist or just living in
just a virtual UCD that you joined. So, but nevertheless, she's been making headway and been connecting with people, which is great under the circumstances. So she's going to talk with us today about education and carbon intensity of well-being, regional analysis. With a more detailed title there on the screen. So thanks very much, Orla. I'll hand over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you very much to the Earth Institute for having me and for hosting these coffee mornings. It's been a lovely way for me, at least, to learn about everybody's work under these lockdown circumstances. So it's been really great. As Taz mentioned, I came was in the US for 10 years, and I joined UCD in September. And this is what I'm going to be presenting on today is based on a paper that I published last year. So it's a cross-national investigation on the relationship between educational attainment and sustainability. So I know it's an interdisciplinary group, so I hope it's interesting, at least for some of you, for the moment. So I will talk a little bit about what I mean about sustainability in this context. So we all know that the term is bandied about and has come to mean many things for many people, some for nefarious purposes. But I'll then talk about how education and sustainability, how we might think that they could be connected. And then I'll present a summary of some of my findings from my work on education and the carbon intensity of well-being. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a discussion. Okay, so defining sustainability. So sustainability, often used in this context interchangeably with sustainable development, is often defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to their needs. So we know that most of you will be very familiar with this definition coming from the World Commission or the Environment and Development, or the Brundtland Report in 1987. So a definition that was the outcome of a lot of consensus building and international negotiation. But it was broadly accepted and has kind of for a long time persisted as the kind of foundational understanding of what we mean by sustainability or sustainable development. And it has been presented often as this tripartite framework of environment, society, and economy. So like all popular concepts, and particularly concepts that come to us through kind of international political processes, it's been the subject of a lot of critique over the years. And often, starting with ecological economists and others, kind of have found it problematic the embrace of economic growth as kind of a pathway, if not compatible, at the least, with environmental and social progress or sustainability. So more recently, sustainability scientists, Griggs and others, have talked about the need to reconceptualize this as development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding the Earth's life support systems on which the welfare of current and future generations depend. So if we look here at this kind of diagram, it's changing this Venn diagram where everything has kind of equal weight to thinking about more about, giving much more credence to the extent to which we are totally embedded and part of and dependent on the Earth's life support system, that society creates the economic arrangements, the economic systems upon which we have kind of taken for granted. So kind of a new paradigm, and this new sustainable development kind of undergirded and informed the Sustainable Development Goals, which everybody is very familiar with, these 17 goals and associated targets. And if you compare these to the predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, which focused a lot on extreme poverty, we can really see the interdependence of this kind of Earth's life support system here, a much more a much more robust treatment of the need to for clean water and sanitation, climate action, and so on. So we see a big departure here of our understanding of human well-being being completely embedded in our ecological world. So kind of thinking about this definition of socio-ecological sustainability, so thinking about human and environmental well-being and their interdependence, there has been a lot of efforts to operationalize this so that we could maybe do research to figure out how some of these goals or some features of society affect human and environmental well-being or economic factors. And again, lots of disciplines have their own ways of doing this. In environmental sociology, one way that has come out is this metric, the carbon intensity of well-being. So it's CO2 per capita, so like GDP, a ratio variable, so CO2 per capita over life expectancy. And not to insult anybody's intelligence with these smiley faces here, but I tend to have a little bit of back and forth with people about this. So basically, what we're a good carbon intensity of well-being is a low carbon intensity of well-being. So if a country has high emissions and low life expectancy, that's kind of the worst case scenario. A lot of damage being done to the environment, human well-being, not a great outcome. We have these kind of two middle scenarios here where there might be high CO2 per capita and high life expectancy, maybe the US or somewhere where that has a lot of high CO2 per capita and relatively high life expectancy compared to other nations in the world. But the sweet spot that we're really looking for is this guy in the sunglasses here, where we have low CO2 per capita and high life expectancy. So this would be a strong sustainability, something that we would from a desirable result. So we this is from my data. I mapped the carbon intensity of well-being this is just an example of different nations. So we see on the whole, mostly to do with gains in life expectancy, we see a decrease in the carbon intensity of well-being over the study period, which is something we would like to see. But there's a lot of heterogeneity here. We can see that in the US, for example, it's still quite high, same as in South Africa. But we do see gains have been made in Senegal has made a lot of gains here, and other regions. So just a regional sample here, some descriptive statistics. So thinking about how education might fall into these things, we can think of education in lots of different ways too. Policies, macro level trends, or micro level beliefs and perceptions. And this research is operationalizing education as in this kind of macro level trend of average years of schooling for the population over 15. Again, a uniform upward trend here for these regions, different starting points, different ending points, but kind of an upward trend. So how might we expect, so we have these two components of the variable, well-being, human well-being and environmental CO2 per capita. In terms of human well-being, well, we can expect that gains in education can have positive impacts on human well-being because it tends to raise household income. It's associated with better nutrition. But over and above these kind of variables related to economic variables, we also know that higher rates of education are associated with better social capital, lower rates of domestic violence, lower rates of infant mortality, better adherence to, better adherence to medical programs, and so on. So we do see in a lot of studies that education can be associated with higher life expectancy. Then looking at education and the environment, which in this study is operationalized by CO2 per capita, we kind of a mixed bag here. We know that education is associated with higher espoused environmental beliefs. It's often, studies have shown that higher educated populations tend to be a predictor of the adoption and ratification of environmental treaties. And so on. But at the other side, we have, from kind of the not so desirable perspective, higher rates of education over and above income kind of come with lifestyle changes that tend to be more impactful, flying more, eating more meat, and so on. So the jury is out. It's a mixed bag in terms of research on education and environmental outcomes. So in my research, I looked at how, if at all, are per capita rates of education associated with sustainability. Does the relationship differ between geographic regions, and how has this effect and the magnitude of this effect changed over time? I won't get into the theoretical frameworks here that I engaged, but just that this is my background's in sociology, so you can be sure there's a theory, and basically that we can expect many theories from different perspectives. Might expect that education would be good for human well-being and environmental well-being as economies kind of might be expected to decarbonize. Sen in the capability framework talks about education as fostering positive feedback loops between civic education, civic participation, enhanced functioning, and then environmental protection. So my research methods, I use regression methods here. I use Praise-Winston two-way fixed effects modeling. So these are conservative modeling techniques. I controlled for GDP per capita, and I also controlled for variance over time and country-specific variance, so they're fixed effects models. And I log all the variables so that they can be interpreted as percent changes. So a 1% increase in educational attainment associated with a X% change in carbon intensity of well-being. So I find overall that particularly outside of advanced economies, that there's this desirable effect, this negative coefficient would be a desirable effect of education on the carbon intensity of well-being across the Asia Pacific region. This is just how I grouped the nations: South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. So that's the results pooled for the time period 1960 to 2015. I also mapped the coefficients over time so that you can have a sense of how this relationship might have changed over time. So here we see the bottom axis here is time, and the top is the expected effect of the carbon intensity of well-being on, or education, excuse me, on the carbon intensity of well-being. And we see here, so the lower down we are here, the better is basically what we want to see. And any kind of coefficient below 0 means that we predict a lower value of carbon intensity of well-being with an increase in education. So we see at the early points of the study, universally, we kind of see a desirable effect of education on the carbon intensity of well-being, but the magnitude of this effect is kind of dissipating over time. So if we look at East Asia Pacific region, we can see that we see a desirable effect, but it fluctuates over time. And by the end of the study period, we're actually beginning to see, which is 2010, an undesirable relationship emerging between education and the carbon intensity of well-being, whereby increases in per capita rates of education attainment are associated with higher carbon intensity of well-being. Interestingly, high income countries offer a bit of a counter trend to this. We have, we see throughout the study period a negative effect of education on the carbon intensity of well-being, and this kind of stays throughout the study period. Sub-Saharan Africa, then, and I'll move on after this, but we can also see that we also have kind of crossed the thresholds by the after 2000s for this undesirable effect of education and sustainability. So these are the same coefficients mapped over time, over years of schooling, as opposed to over time. And the idea here is to show that education is the same way or isn't. We're not predicting that it has the same effects on the carbon intensity of well-being at different levels of education. So I'll give you an example here. For the Sub-Saharan Africa region, we see that it crosses the threshold of being good for sustainability, of lower carbon intensity of well-being, at just 4 years of per capita education. On the other hand, we see high income nations here where we continue to see this desirable effect of education on the carbon intensity of well-being at the kind of secondary school and heading to the post-secondary school level. So a lot of variation here, just to show that, you know, as well as a temporal variation, it can be sometimes easier to think about this as kind of different levels of education. Okay, so importantly, you know, it's played an important historic role for national sustainability outcomes. The largest effects we've seen are observed in this study are for countries in the South Asia and East Asia Pacific regions. They've disappeared, albeit at different rates, up to 2010, but advanced economies kind of offer an interesting counter trend to this. And we see actually that the carbon intensity of well-being in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America has actually crossed over to that kind of undesirable region of the plot by the end of the study period. So, a lot of implications here, the need to think about education as, what is the role of education? Are we increasing human capital, or are we increasing human resources for transformative social change? What is the role of education here? And, the need to think about, if we are to, there's a lot of evidence that education can it does enhance, is associated with longer life expectancy, and that is a moral and ethical and an absolute unnegotiable goal that we have to have. But how can we think about the social institution of education in a way that takes human well-being in this holistic sense, as encompassing both environmental and kind of short-term human well-being gains? How do we have it function for this strong version of sustainability that we know we need for a long-term functioning of society? And then again, this is kind of just a wrap up, but this is a snapshot of the ways we can think about education in this way. This is a macro level way of looking at it. I'm also doing work looking at the carbon intensity of well-being and political decision making in the US at the state level, and just started a consortium on education and climate change at the tertiary level. So how can we build a robust and institutions for forwarding a sustainability and agenda at the tertiary level? And we've got lots of people from Africa and Asia and parts of or Europe, and parts of Australia participating in this. So just there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and we can think about it in many different ways. And I suppose my research is trying to show that we can't really think about education as this kind of silver bullet for sustainability, given how complex this concept is. Okay, that's it for me. A quick drive-by of the research, and I welcome any questions or comments that people have. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Orla. That's fascinating stuff. Yeah, really interesting, and in some ways counterintuitive, I guess, but resonant. Does anyone have any comments or questions they'd like to ask? Nessa.
Well, thanks. That was really so interesting. I'm really pleased to see the more positive story for advanced economies. And I'm just curious, have you done a kind of subnational, or sorry, an analysis of different parts of or different regions? I mean,
yeah.
For example, see the Scandinavians doing better than other advanced economies, for example.
Yeah.
In the expected way.
Yeah, thanks, Nessa. So I would say with the advanced economy story, so I'm starting this, my subnational is starting at the US, so the US state level, to kind of figure out how maybe the percent of the population with a college level degree affects the political landscape there. So that's kind of a meso level way of trying to understand it. And one thing about the advanced economy, so other environmental sociologists use this metric all the time too, and my colleague Jennifer Givens used it. And one kind of caveat with the advanced economies is that the CO2 measure that I use is production-based CO2. So there is some kind of equity element here of, as advanced economies, as economies become more educated and economies change, to what extent are we outsourcing our CO2 emissions? So maybe that's the next research that I'm doing. I'm looking at integration into the global economy and how it affects this. But that's kind of another way, a kind of challenge to thinking about the gains that we see at higher income countries. But actually the paper I'm working at the moment has education up to 2015. And we see this kind of high income country trend continuing and actually growing in magnitude. So this isn't a blip of this data. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, but one not so great one, which might be this kind of measure of production-based emissions. So another way to think about it might be to look at consumption-based emissions too. And that's something else that I want to say about this carbon intensity of well-being measure is I use consumption-based CO2 and life expectancy, but others can plug in, you can use ecological footprint or some other measures of human well-being there in the denominator. So a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, but the best I can do. Nessa. Yeah.
Anybody else?
I have some comments.
Yeah.
So that was great. So actually, it's a great presentation because I actually have lots of comments. So I wouldn't say but it's just made me think. So the first one, to be honest, I hadn't seen this Griggs and Tal before, you know, and I should have maybe. This concept of weak and strong sustainability, right? So the way I kind of think about it, there's certainly a conflict in the goals, or in the Sustainable Development Goals, and that, how do I put this? Maybe the simplest way to put it is that, you know, a lot of them can work on the basis of we're trying to transition to something. So that's like taking the status quo, which has been, let's face it, households and companies have been very mean to nature, and economies have been very mean to society. But and the idea is that they would somehow make things a bit more inclusive and sustainable. And that's kind of putting a bigger emphasis on the economy as the game changer, I guess. And they have to make a move. That's the way I look at that dartboard that you put up, right? But to be fair to the guys in the UN, though, they stress transformation. And the idea is that we've got to change the nature of households and companies and create positive spillovers on society and nature, not negative ones. Now, there is a conflict, though, because there's no doubt when you look at the targets of the agenda, and we did an analysis of the way they were done in the open working group, is that there was key outcomes of agencies, then there was linkage variables, and then there was means implementation. The linkage variables, if you look at the language, is never positive. It always goes, we must reduce the amount of plastic in the sea, and rather than saying we must enhance the nature of coastal area, you know what I mean? So it's always kind of and that would kind of back up your idea of weak sustainability, because it's not ambitious in the actual English statements of those linkages and stuff, you know. But anyway, the only thing my main point is that I don't think we should be putting nature, society, and economy in silos in any graph, like either as wedding cakes, or as the scientists do, or donuts as economists do, if we've seen that, donut economics. And now we have a dartboard that maybe sociologists are working at. But all of them are making a crucial mistake. They're keeping everything in a silo, right? Because what really has to happen, either we're going to be half-earth people, you know, where we're just going to say, you call it that humans have to stay off land and sea, and you know, separate it out, that there is, you know, biologists or biodiversity people who promote that, or we genuinely think we have the policies and technologies to integrate society, economy, and environment in a way that is sustainable and give it a very strong sustainability. You know what I mean? So I guess, and you do come down, like there's no doubt in the later part of your talk, you talk like you are talking about linkages. This is exactly what you're talking about, you know? So I kind of, so this is not in any textbook or anything. I'm just kind of, to me, what we promote anyway is this idea of transformation and positive linkages and integrated approaches, and smash up the wedding cake, smash up the donut. On every issue, you have to take integrated approaches, right? That's just one point. The second point, and I'd love to talk to you about it, is to have a look at, I work with a crowd called the UN SDSN, and we've launched a thing called Mission 4.7. I don't know whether you've seen this.
No, I don't know.
So this is an initiative by the Pontifical Academy of Science, Social Science in the Vatican, UNESCO, UN SDSN, Ban Ki-moon Center in Geneva. And we take target 4.7. And what that stresses is, it's kind of an unusual, this is obviously goal 4, education target 7. I can't read it out to you, but the essence of it is that the old Newman thing is that knowledge is not virtue. Just because you create knowledge, just because you have years of school, just because you're wherever, it doesn't mean you're educating people to be sensitized, to be kind to nature and kind to people. That's not the way it works, right? So that goal asks people to, from preschool all the way up into university, to actually change the nature in a dynamic way of the knowledge you create, and to make sure that it's orientated to sustainable development, however you define it, okay? And I was kind of keen to the center it's a kind of a different thing, that I think UCD does have, whether we know it or not, like we do have open learning courses for secondary school and onwards on sustainability. we've a new undergrad degree on sustainability, we've a new master's degree, we've a PhD. So in a sense, we can create this pathway, and even through the department, our School of Education, we should be maybe with primary, going preschool to primary school, we should be able to say, we as a third level can engage in changing the nature of education at all levels and create an interoperable kind of time path through education. I know that's what you'd be getting at. I know that's exactly what you'd be doing. But just to say that is the mission of 4.7.
That's great.
True in that, and we can link into that very easily. I don't know whether you mightn't be interested.
Yeah, no, I am. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sounds like a really worthwhile thing.
My last point. Are you kicking me off?
It'd be good to give Orla a chance to respond to maybe to either of those points, but the second one, I actually agree with both of those perspectives. Were both things that have crossed my mind, and I've struggled with those diagrams as well, wanting to see the overlap there. But actually, the thing I would be interested, Orla, is the nature of the education, which I guess is what Paul is getting at in the second point. And is there research at that level to show that if it's the nature of the research can change and yield better outcomes, more predictably positive outcomes?
Okay, well thank you both. I wish we had more time, but I would just say a couple of things on the negative nature of the goals. Better than me, being part of these working groups, it's so hard to get consensus. So maybe that's just a function of that. Political processes aren't always the conceptual ideal that we aspire to. And in terms of not smashing up the cake, that's what I'm trying to do, or we're trying to do in a way with this ratio. I get so much pushback, from reviewers. Oh, you should just look at CO2. It's hard to interpret this ratio. You should just have CO2 emissions, or you should just have, depending on the reviewer, or you should just have life expectancy. But the idea of this kind of metric is to say, okay, we can't have human well-being without embedding this in this circle. You know what I mean? So I that's kind of what this is trying to do. I agree with you. And then just kind of from my social policy kind of sociological perspective, I totally agree with you. It's transformative social change that we want. And I would say that, if we go back to this kind of thing here, the society, here's where we have the power. Here's where we have the power to enhance to these double dividend policies, be it reduced working hours, be it education policies that enhance our well-being, not just focus on workforce supply, but rather a focus on how can we live in harmony with the natural world, education for human and environmental well-being, work for human and environmental well-being. Here's the opportunity. It's the challenge, but it's also the opportunity in a way for these things to work in this kind of double dividend way. So, a lot of interesting work going to happen in there too. I agree totally as well on the UCD things. We've so many kind of somewhat disparate but exciting things happening, and I'm only new, so trying to get to know at the moment. But that's also what we're this initiative that I've started with the World University Network to try and look at other. It's people who have sustainability masters and other kind of things in universities in different contexts, so that we can kind of glean lessons. And my hope that could help for us here in the Earth Institute and UCD and other places too, to try and get ideas, or not that there aren't lots of fabulous ideas and initiatives already, but can also always helps to collaborate or whatever. And then a lot of people in education doing work on what does it mean to live to educate for sustainability, and drawing back to indigenous perspectives, where there are rooted in this understanding of a sustainable future, which maybe this doesn't have to be something that we recreate. There is other ways of being, other ways of living that are more in harmony, and what can we glean from them in our efforts to redesign our societal institutions to work for us as opposed to the economy. I say so. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed, Orla.
Okay.
We're on 11:30 now. I don't know if anyone else has a quick question. I always raise it. Mona, yeah, fire away.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Orla, for the very nice presentation. That was a food for thought for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So generally speaking, when it comes to sustainable development and education, the role of women and children are really bold just to my surprise, I want to know, are you going to study specifically in these areas, especially in Eastern countries, because you mentioned Saudi Arabia and some other Asian countries? It's really interesting to me. Are you going to focus on these two key roles, or have you focused?
Yeah, you raised a really good point, Mona. You know, I think when I was trying to interpret some of these results, particularly the South Asian results and East Asia Pacific, you know, the gains in some of the ways that I suspect the carbon intensity of well-being is being positively affected here is those huge gains in maternal mortality and infant mortality here, and that's one way that education did work. I think positively. So yeah, I have actually created a separate carbon intensity female, like a sex-specific carbon intensity of well-being. I've published one paper on that in the US, and I tried it with this data, and I never really got time yet to do anything with it. But I didn't find sex-specific effects really. But certainly there's gender is another area of interest of mine that I definitely work on. And there's this is also, you know, thinking about redesigning education and sustainability in participatory ways. You know, historically, women haven't been involved enough and underrepresented people in these, same as, you know, Indigenous and other perspectives in how we might think about reforming our social institutions. So a participatory role for women and other traditionally marginalized groups is a huge part of that. So yeah, I definitely take your point.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, listen, we're over time. So what I propose to do is to say thank you very much to Orla, and I think it was really fascinating and then a really stimulating discussion at that point. And anybody that wants to go can, but if you don't mind, maybe Paul could make his third point as well. I'd hate to kind of cut off the discussion just because the clock has ticked over. So anybody that wants to go can, but if you're happy to take Paul's third perspective.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Please fire away, Paul.
No, I think it's kind of was answered in the conversation. I guess the only with I play around. Well, I have one paper on the Human Development Index, you know, which you know is a composite of life expectancy, whatever school completion, or in previous incarnations it was enrollment rates in school, whatever, and GDP per capita, obviously in PPP dollars. And I hope everyone knows that normalization of purchasing power parity was by Roy Geary. The UCD Geary Institute's called after that statistician. So he's probably one of the most famous statisticians. Everyone uses GDP per capita and PPP. And I had as a homework in the class, but I've never quite got, I was just saying, we were adding in things like CO2, you know, emissions per capita, or adding in measures of governance to try and expand the Human Development Index into a more comprehensive index, you know. But I liked, there's lots of work on that. And in some ways, when you are running CO2 per capita over, I don't know, maybe a life expectancy index, I wasn't sure, divided by 100, and then running it on schooling, in some ways you were in that type of literature. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those variables, but you were bringing in obviously the health of the environment, and not just human health and etc. So I just thought it was I was just going to make that point, that it was related to that.
Yeah, and I'll say I think they are. Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you there.
No, John. Yeah,
but,
that's
but yeah, I would say that the omission, the kind of inclusion of an environmental variable, and I know I'm speaking to an economist here, but the exclusion of the kind of purchasing power parity or some kind of economic variable is kind of by design, by Dietz and Jorgensen and others that kind of developed this to really assess how, you know, how the economy, so that we could kind of really think about how the economy as we know it now, as it will be in the future, and you know, historically, is affecting this socio, you know, a deliberate kind of socio-ecological measure of sustainability. And I think it gives a lot of scope to do more analyses, to look at, you know, the first carbon intensity of well-being paper that was published in Nature Sustainability looked at how GDP affects the carbon intensity of well-being. So it's an effort to try and kind of understand the relationship between the economy and these kind of this socio-ecological measure. So yeah, absolutely, in that literature, in that trend, I take your point completely. Spot on.
Fantastic. All right, that's wonderful. Thanks very much indeed. It sounds to me like there's a lot more discussion to be had on the back of this kind of interaction as well. And I'd really like to talk to you some more about these kinds of things as well. I wonder if you might try to find an evolution of the sustainability diagram that retains the integration and overlap, but does give some sense of a hierarchy there as well. So
yeah. Absolutely.
All great food for thought. So
great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the great engagement. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Ted.